Hello and welcome everyone. So today's session is on academic writing and research methodology, and it will be conducted by Mr. Ajay Sabharwal, founder and president of the IYEA. So now we're going to get started with the session. Handing over to Ajay.
Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the third session of the Indian Youth Economic Association's Internship and Mentorship Program for 2020. Today's session is titled Research Methodology and Academic Writing. It might as well have been titled Advanced Critical Thinking, Rethinking Research Methodology in Economics, History and Law, and Introduction to Academic Writing in these particular fields. In one sense, you could consider it an advanced version or an intermediate version of the module that all of you attended yesterday. That was an introduction to basic logic and critical thinking. But that does not mean that this is not a standalone module in its own self. Right? It covers themes which are independent of the module that was conducted yesterday and will help you in furthering your arguments in the fields that you have taken. I will first present a brief outline regarding the various topics that I will be covering in this 1 hour or perhaps longer session. Right. I shall be beginning with covering economic rethinking and decision making. What are some of the norms that have changed in these fields? Right. I will be introducing certain economic thinkers, and I will be talking about the approach that they have taken in their respective fields. Right. This will deal with the broad ambit of economic thinking as well as decision making. Thereafter, we will move to history and politics and the approaches that can be taken in these fields. What are some of the key errors that are very often made while dealing with these fields, and how history and politics sort of tie well with the other two topics, that is economics and law. Post that, we will be moving to the third substantive topic area, which is law, and what is the necessary context to understand its development over the years. We will be looking at a historical context as well as an approach to how to go about researching questions of law. Just as a small pointer here, we will not be looking at how to deal with case briefs or how this will necessarily help you in, let's say, handling a particular case which has a certain component called facts, right? How to deal with facts is another issue, which perhaps we can leave for another module. We're just looking at research methodology in law. So the facts component will not be something that we'll be taking up, at least for today. Giving the necessary context to the study of law and jurisprudence, we will thereafter move to academic writing, a brief introduction, how to structure your argument, right? And post that, if time does permit us, we will briefly touch upon what referencing is, what is citation. At the end of it, we'll send you some links. What are some of the methods in which you can approach this, and what is plagiarism, and why it must be avoided, and how you can avoid it, right? That's where citation and referencing will come in handy. And post that, again, like I say, if the time does permit, then we will look at the ethics of argumentation, right? One component of ethics of academic writing is obviously, like I said, referencing, citation, and avoiding plagiarism at the same time, whether intended or unintended. At the same time, we will try to look at the ethics of argumentation, which I believe is also a substantive part. Right? It is as substantive as, let's say, the areas that you're focusing on. And when we get to that point, you will realize, why do I say so? Right? These are the broad areas that I wish to cover today. And now I'll begin with economic rethinking and decision making. Right? So as a starting point, I'd like to share with you some of the work that we've done in this regard. Many of our interns over the years have been introduced to new concepts which they might not otherwise have been familiarized in their classrooms, right? And the fundamental approach to something like this is utilizing economic tools to understand and to deal with social problems. Right? This method has been, in one sense, at least in the last 60 to 70, maybe even 80 odd years, has been focused on and has been propagated by two very eminent economists. Again, I will be naming a lot of thinkers and economists during the course of this session. I will not be getting into what laurels they have brought, how many of them have got a Nobel Prize, how many of them choose to absolutely refuse any sort of award. You can feel free to sort of Google that by yourself. But rest assured that these are some of the finest minds in their field, the most intelligent people in that regard. Yes, it's coming back to the approach of sort of utilizing economic tools, and I would say specifically microeconomic tools to understand, examine, and deal with social problems. So two economists who've dealt with this issue and this approach extensively are Gary Becker and Thomas Sowell. Now, before I get into the specific details of their research and the specific parts, at least, that I will be drawing on to set some examples, I would say that the focus of this module is on the research methodology, the approach taken to research here, while you can always take into account the matter or the sort of substantive area that they focus on. And you will obviously be reading about it. That's where the methodology is derived from. The idea is not to restrict yourself to, okay, what is the substance of the argument? You can always take that up, right? And we can always discuss that at a later stage, perhaps in some of the mentoring sessions. But right now, the focus has to be on the approach, what to do, how to do it, what to avoid, and what to sort of take as priority. So what is the approach that they have taken? Professor Sowell and Professor Becker focus on the idea that when you're dealing with social problems, you mustn't sort of look at them as mere abstract social evils. Right? The best way to tackle a problem is to try to narrow it down. And they provide a tool by utilizing sort of microeconomic analysis. And in that sense, market behavior in the, let's say, the labor market, if I were to specifically point down on some of the issues that I will be raising in this regard. Right? Now, the important point here is that this is also in the context of the 20th century, the second half, where this happens. Now, while this approach was sort of starting to shape up in the world of these economists, some of them coming from the Chicago school, they were not given much credence from their fellow economists. Neither were they given sort of a lot of support. This is again at the initial stage, might be, right? Neither they were sort of entertained a lot by some of the sociologists and some of the sort of behavioral experts, some of the political scientists, if I may use that term, to utilize these problems. But as time progressed, as their ideas were sort of examined in light of the real world realities, both economists as well as sort of people coming in from the social sciences realized that this is one method, and to some extent, it has a lot of prudence to look at the problems that the world faces. So two area problems that I'll pick up are the questions of race and racial discrimination in the United States in the labor force, and that is gender discrimination and the specific focus in terms of the wage gap in that regard. Right? So beginning with Professor Sowell's work and Professor Becker's work in this regard. So ultimately, they sort of try to narrow down the problem and try to sort of look at it in the context of this. While again, that does not mean this is the only context or the only approach to look at it. I think this is one way of looking at it. That is that ultimately the problem of racial discrimination by employers against ethnic minority employees can be determined or can be sort of classified as a labor market problem. In the sense, and they say that to a certain extent, you could argue that those employers or those companies or firms that discriminate against a certain community in terms of hiring them or sort of paying them an equal salary or giving them work on those lines, or to give them, let's say, discriminatory treatment, if one may, there will be an outflow of the labor from that area. Again, the labor here is not to be looked at in the context of a political term that, okay, these are the working class members, working classes members. This is looking at the economic context of people who are employees. And ultimately, those firms which do not discriminate or which do not sort of follow a policy of sort of racial discrimination in their employment policies or their human resource, so to say, these people will move to, or these set of employees will gradually move towards those firms which do not discriminate. In that sense, it is a supply-demand problem, that there is an adequate demand from those sites which do not discriminate, and the supply is obviously being reduced in areas where you have racial discrimination policies taking place. Now, what has been argued here by the thinkers, and I would even say the economists in that sense, who take this up, is that to a large extent, you could argue that there is this behavior of, let's say, racial discrimination. They don't get into, let's say, fundamental or historical factors per se, but they say that to a certain extent, you could say that the market by itself or the marketplace has to be at the forefront of either accepting or rejecting such behavior, because firms will tilt their policies according to what the customer requires. So in some sense, they say that it is the customer that subsidizes this kind of behavior. A customer that is adamant that he wishes to, let's say, work with a particular firm which does not follow any racial discrimination policies will receive that kind of a treatment, in the sense that those firms will be more inclined towards having an approach which is not discriminatory in nature. Right? A similar approach is taken by Professor Taleb, who deals with the idea of an intolerant minority. Now, you mustn't look at it in a normative sense that intolerant is a bad idea here, but the idea that a small group of people with a preference that is with, let's say, less than the majority, if they are sort of, in a sense, again, for the lack of a better phrase, stubborn, that they stick to that point, okay, we want to deal with a company which is not following discriminatory policies, to adequately change the preferences of the firms. Now, while you wouldn't say that Gary Becker was a behavioral economist, and I think that's a distinction that must be made, but he did sort of pitch the idea, at least indirectly, if not directly, that outcomes, social outcomes could in this sense be influenced, you could say, by indirect or direct bargaining, right? Where customers influence the behavior of firms, and firms ultimately change their policies towards the employees and the employment policies in that regard. Similarly, in the question of sort of wage gap, while some theories suggest, and there is some data to suggest, I wouldn't say just theories, and this is the conventional view, that there is an extensive gap between, let's say, the average working male and the average working female, or even if you remove the working component per se, but you just look at a broad average. And that's the larger problem with sort of dealing in very large body or data or numbers, right? Or like I said, dealing in a very abstract notion of sort of all types of people in one category and all types of people in another category. Well, what is sort of pitched as an argument herein is that you must try to narrow it down as much as you can to get to the point where you can differentiate between mere statistical variance and a discriminatory policy. Now, it is important to note here that all statistical variance by itself, right, where there is a difference in terms of numbers, would not necessarily mean that there is a discriminatory policy. But wherever there is a discriminatory policy, and I'll get to how that happens and where that happens, there will be some sort of statistical variance, right? So you need to differentiate between that X leads to Y, not Y leads to X. Now, coming to the specific sort of meat of the argument here, what is argued here is that the most efficient way, or at least the most accurate way, if I may, of trying to deal with this problem is to compare working individuals, males and females, people who come from, let's say, the same fields, people who are coming in, let's say, the same sectors or industries, people who work in the same type of firms, people who work in the same firms, people who have a similar job, people who have a similar role, and people who perform in a similar function. One component to add to this is obviously how much hours are being brought in. While that is one factor, that by itself is again not sufficient. Now, an important factor is that I listed out these 3-4 factors, right? Function, role, industry, type of job, hours put in. Certain factors they bring in are married, unmarried, with children, without children. The important part here is, and again, when we're dealing with sensitive issues such as discrimination, and which are also very relevant in that regard, the idea is to try to make the problem when we're dealing with it as accurate in terms of the assessment that we have to carry out, so that there can be no generalities that you sort of deal in. And that's the idea of sort of trying to avoid the abstract, because you want to come up with an ultimate solution as to what is it that you must tackle to begin with. And that is where this part comes, where you have the same kind of role being performed, where you have the same kind of function, or same firm, same industry, and there you have a difference in pay, the base pay we're talking about here. Then there is an actionable claim that arises from that. That may be significant in determining that, okay, yes, there is some discrimination in terms of the policy that is being followed by a firm, right? So this is an approach. And what is the approach and what is the sort of method that is being employed here? Is that one, you must look at the data, you must look at it in specific narrow terms, and at the same time, you must not deal in abstract notions, right? That's the best way of trying to look at an issue and try to come up with a solution for it in a manner that is as accurate as is possible, right? But here is the key, right? Now let's move to some of the other thinkers. Well, data by itself is absolutely necessary for any study in economics. It is equally relevant that we deal with data and deal with how the questions that are posed around that data are dealt with. Now, I'll give you a thought experiment here, right? And some of you might already be familiar with this, but still, just as a thought experiment, you can carry it out. I'm selling collectively a bat and a ball for 110 rupees. I would like you to answer and just think in your mind, at least the instinctive answer that comes to your mind. When I ask you the question that if the bat costs 100 rupees more than the ball, how much does the ball cost individually? Now, the instinctive answer for many would have been 10 rupees. While some of you who may be privy to this problem would have come to the answer that no, it is 5 rupees. Because our idea, the equation that we are solving is 1 equals to price of bat minus price of ball. But your instinctive approach was total price equals to price of bat minus price of ball. And that is where the error occurs of those 5 rupees. Now, how do we deal with this problem? And why does this problem occur? I want to get to one of the foremost thinkers of our times, Daniel Kahneman. Some of you might have already heard of him. Some of you might have already been familiar with the works that he's conducted, that is in the field of sort of thinking, decision making. And obviously his famous book bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. So what he's pitching here as an idea is that there are 2 systems, right? Again, the idea is that these aren't biological neuroscientific realities. It's a useful fiction for us to understand, right? So the system 1 and system 2. System 1 specifically deals with the idea that it's the part of the brain that sort of looks at gut instinct, right? Your instinct, your gut feeling. Like you guys, some of you might have thought of, let's say 5 rupees is not the answer, but like 10 rupees is the answer. If I were to, let's say, okay, pose a mathematical problem where you're required to, however, get into complex calculations, would you be applying the system 1? Probably not, right? So what you do, you start calculating. You start putting in deliberate thinking effort. And that is the role of what he calls system 2, which puts in a calculation, puts in effort, which is slow thinking. So system 1 is fast thinking, which is instinctive, like a gut feeling. And system 2 is, in a sense, slow thinking. Now, the idea is then when we're dealing we've evolved evolutionary in that sense. And I will be getting to this later when we sort of deal with some of the other thinkers, that there is an advantage to system one as well. There is a very strong reason why we still have it. And you might say, okay, we should always focus on system two. And that must be an attempt, most certainly. And when you're dealing with, let's say, complex issues that require significant thinking, that is the important way, or one of the sort of key methods that you must follow, right? Again, Professor Kahneman deals with biases in this respect, right? Why do we have system one and system two? Because system one sort of stems from certain biases. These biases include confirmation bias. They look at hindsight bias, that we sort of go back in memory, right? We don't want to perform that complex calculation. We don't want to perform that complex task, because we're hardwired over the years of sort of evolutionary mechanisms. And I will be coming to the specifics of this. In a sense, to be lazy, in a sense, to the phrase that is utilized here is cognitive ease. If without much effort we can get to the main solution, what we think to be right based on what we might know, we think to know to be correct, we'll say, okay, this is the right approach because it requires maybe less effort. Now, this is clubbed with the other idea is of what you see is all that there is. Right? And what's the point about this? That you see how things are on the surface, right? I said it. 1, 10, 110, 1 rupee, 10 rupees, the natural answer. You just see things on the surface. You don't perform the next step. So the system one thinking coupled with what you see is all there is leads to these biases coming into play, and that leads to, let's say, and maybe an outcome which is, or thinking process which is not entirely rational. But does that mean that all humans who sort of take this approach are entirely irrational? Probably not. And why is that so? Because on some level, all data by itself, even if over a long term, might not necessarily lead you to the best conclusion. Let's think about this. Okay, we're in, let's say, October of 2020, right? You're a turkey. Think of yourself as an animal, a bird, a turkey. An American family takes you in, right? And they feed you every day, they clean you every day, they even sort of clothe you from time to time. And they feed you so much that you're getting fatter by the day. If you go by the data that you're getting each day, the input, you would think, hey, these guys really care for me. They're giving me food, they're cleaning me, I'm getting so much food, I was never getting it at the farm. These guys are really great people. They'll always take care of me because they've been taking care of me up until this point. And then suddenly, on a Tuesday or a Wednesday of the 3rd week of November, you realize that you are being chopped off. In that sense, you're literally dead meat. Why? Because Thanksgiving dinner is around the corner, and that is what you were being groomed for. So you're getting long-term data that is signaling something, but that does not mean that even that long-term data necessarily gives you an accurate picture of what the future holds. And that is where I get to the next thinker, ladies and gentlemen. That is Professor Nassim Nicholas Taleb, whose primary work deals with fat tails, risk, uncertainty, and the sort of power law. I would be talking about just a one-liner or two-liners to the main argument of all of his books. Before getting to that, I'll just give you the idea of sort of fat tails, right? Those of you economics students and those of you sort of have a very elementary understanding of statistics might get this. But for those of you who don't, I'll try to make a very basic picture, and we sort of have to also rush up. And we'll be on the lines that a distribution, right? So we're dealing with a normal distribution here. I'm hoping that most of you are sort of familiar with this idea of normal distribution, the Gaussian distribution. The idea here is that all probability distributions are probability possibilities sort of put on a probability distribution, right? And in a sense, that leads to a bell curve, a curve which sort of peaks in the center, in the middle, near the sort of the mean and the sort of median are pretty much, in fact, the mode even, pretty much around the same area. And we have sort of thin tails. That means the extremely variant probabilities, right? The probabilities which have the least chance or the sort of lowest probability events are obviously the most unlikely, right? So they are the end, that the variance in that sense from the average, the mean, in the middle of the bell curve is the furthest away. Now, a problem here is that because we're looking at a very specific set, we assume that the local maxima and minima deals with the data points that we're dealing with and not the universal maxima minima. We tend to cut the tails. Whereas in reality, in the real world, the tails are much fatter. That is, the extreme events are not as unlikely as you think they are. And when you build these models, such as those in finance might be familiar with the black codes, that's when you get to realize that why they don't work. Because the real world does not fit into a normal distribution. The real world is not a perfectly skewed bell curve. It is skewed in one side. It has fat tails. And that is why I would say, for those of you who want to sort of get an idea of how to look at the impact of COVID and pandemics and fat tail sort of events, Professor Taleb's works are in fact the best, at least a starting point, a very good area to sort of deal with. In my opinion, I think when it comes to questions of risk, he's undoubtedly one of the finest minds in the world. I would go to the extent of saying ever. Right? But again, this is my opinion, and this is my bias. The book specifically, Fooled by Randomness, again, as its name suggests, deals with the fact that we take in a lot of information. Not all of it is necessarily relevant. And in that sense, you have randomness, right? A random event which will have more significance in terms of the impact that it causes, right? Rather than say, okay, this is significance in terms of, okay, the input side. Right? That's why sort of the desire to draw patterns, okay, doesn't sound relevant. The idea, okay, the p-values, let's say the extremely end part of the tail, the extremely low probabilities, which you sort of even consider random in that sense. They are the ones that have some value, like we'll be fooled by them in that sense. The next point is obviously black swan. Some of you might have heard of this. People in the finance world definitely have. Maybe you will get to know a lot about this in the finance modules that they have planned for the coming week. The idea here is simple, that up until the point that a black swan is discovered, a highly unlikely, improbable, and thought of absolutely an impossible event, you think that all swans are white. But the moment you see one, you realize that there is a black swan and that not all swans are white. The idea here is, and the pitch that's made here is that just because an event is rare, just because an event is something that you haven't accounted for, that you haven't planned for, doesn't make it a black swan. And people have utilized this to sort of do away with their liability towards issues where they should have been liable, both in terms of finance and medicine and the like. Whereas something like a COVID, many might say, is a black swan event, but perhaps it's not. It's not like we didn't see it coming. We saw cases rising in China. We saw cases first in Wuhan, then in China, then in Europe, then in other parts of the world. Let's say by the time we go to India, we had a very good idea of what's the problem, that there is a problem, what the problem looks like. We might not have gotten into the detail of it, but we had a very good idea of what the problem is and what are the possible solutions that we can carry out where at a later stage, the impact would not be as much. And therefore, this is not a black swan. A black swan is something that cannot be anticipated. It's something that cannot be necessarily in a detailed manner, in a very pinpointed manner, be prepared for. You can prepare for it only in the sense of having structural reform, let's say having sort of equipment available, having sort of a generalistic approach, that having enough masks available to begin with without sort of getting to know there is a pandemic, or having to have enough ventilators prepared, etc. That's the idea of black swan. Next book is Antifragile. Very sort of short idea that, okay, our conception of fragility is that, okay, things that break when they're sort of met with disorder. Idea of robustness is that things that sort of stay the same when they're met with sort of stress and disorder. A third idea, which sort of Professor Taleb sort of builds up on, is the idea of anti-fragility, things that gain from disorder, decentralized mechanisms. And sort of we here get in the notions of sort of scalability, the notions of non-linearity, right? And the notions of sort of the power rule. And I'll sort of briefly touch upon this along with what are called emergent properties, right? Before I get to that, the next work is called Skin the Game, where the idea is that you have your skin in the game, and that you can be held liable for your actions, right? The decisions that you take, you shouldn't be bereft of the responsibility that comes with taking those decisions. That you can't be divorced with, let's say, the accountability of your decisions. And in that sense, he's also sort of gone on to write a book on aphorisms called The Bed of Procrustes, which is sort of philosophical and practical aphorisms, let's say one-liners or two-liners, or sort of, in a sense, small sort of quotations from his side, which deal with sort of practical philosophy in that sense. Right? Which sort of spices similar ideas about, like I said, risks, power law. Power law, how does it deal with? Okay, so a very small change in one variable leads to a very large change in another variable, right? Exponential, right? So that's where you get to the idea of non-linearity. And I'm not going to get into the details of it because I understand this is an introductory model. But why you have to look at these concepts is because they're more in touch with reality, right? You might see that for a very long period, let's say a chart for a particular stock or a particular, so sort of any sort of index could be, let's say, something like this, right? Which is sort of, there's not much in terms of that you see as traction. But at some point, let's say crossing this threshold, the chart sort of just goes like this. Right? It's pretty flat. And then it sort of rises in a logarithmic fashion. Right? So this gives us the property of sort of non-linearity. Right? That things aren't, in terms of a graph chart, always x equals y. Right? Things can be a lot different. That's why sort of we look at log models rather than linear models. Right? These are approaches that are applied. And when we come to sort of emergent properties, the idea is that the way a group functions as a whole is very different from how one individual or some individuals in that group function. Right? For example, let's take the example of ants, right? Ant colonies, how they sort of structure themselves. Every individual ant is performing a different function, and the whole sort of group is performing something altogether different. Similarly, let's say you can look at the concept of, on a political structure level, something in the area of, let's say, a Senate or a parliament or any political government structure. You might argue that individuals, or let's say your elected representative, is a great person. Right? And in most likelihood, they're sort of all good people with your best intentions in their hearts. But when these interests clash, let's say the interests of, let's say, Delhi constituency, there's a New Delhi constituency versus South Delhi constituency versus, let's say, a constituency in Lucknow, right? When these interests clash, they'll say, okay, no, I want the best for my people. I want the best for my people. There will be a clash. And when that clash occurs, you realize, okay, maybe when parliament functions as a whole, or when like a Senate or a House of Representatives functions as a whole, its properties are very different from how individuals function. Just examples, just approaches that we must take when we're dealing with such issues. Right? Now, briefly, just talking about the idea of being rational about rationality. We must deal with bounded rationality. Right? We cannot possibly say that, okay, I would be rational to the T, in the sense that, okay, elementary logic by itself has answers to all problems. There are other thinkers who have also dealt with this expressly in a lot of ways. Right? The sort of school of thought here is Homo economicus. That a rational man will do anything if there's even the slightest margin increase in terms of benefits to him. But think about it. Why do people offer flowers to the dead friends? It's not like those people who are dead will sort of be able to perceive them. And it's not like you're sort of gaining anything out of it. Let's say in monetary terms, there's a loss. There's a very simplistic example. Obviously, there are more sort of more complex areas where we apply this. But the rationality behind this, right? Why don't we always have to sort of look at it in a logical, okay, these are the alternatives, this is more beneficial, so I will go with this problem. So why do we sort of not go with that approach? And this is where I'm getting back to system one. Why do we have system one, right? Well, what is the sort of benefit of system one? You know, drawing from Kahneman. The point here is the point that Kahneman's also pitching, not Kahneman's pitching, but some Taleb and sort of thinkers who come from a similar line of thought. There are many, and those of you working in these fields will sort of get a good idea about it. Is that on some level, this is an evolutionary mechanism. How? Now think about it, the ancient men and women. Who do you think is most likely to survive, and who do you think is most likely to sort of pass on their genes to you as a result of having survived, right? So those who are dead will obviously not have been able to do that. Someone who sort of stands there, sits down, starts sort of creating algorithms, starts to calculate, okay, what is this lion going to do? What time does this lion appear at? Let me create a methodical approach. Day 1, lion does this. Day 2, he tries to sort of build up an entire model, think about problems, looks at a slow, calculative approach to how to deal with the wild beast or sort of dangers in the dark and in the sort of wild. Versus someone who says, okay, my instinct's going to be just run away when the lion appears. I might as well hunt a smaller animal or sort of get some wild berries rather than say that I'm going to analyze, sort of think about, describe, structure my argument as to how to deal with a lion. And in that sense, it is hardwired in us because the end point of this has to be survival. Right? The idea of rationality, and Professor Taleb talks about it when he talks about what is Lindy. Now, Lindy is something that if it's something that's been around for long enough, is more likely to be around for much longer. Right? We will deal with these concepts if you sort of pick up these fields. But the idea here is that what is the Lindy aspect of rationality? It deals with this in Skin in the Game. And the idea here is that if the person who's wisest, most prudent, and this is not necessarily elementary 101 logic, that's why I said this module can be an intermediate logic for a discussion, is that there is the end point, the end goal of being rational, so to say, and that end goal is first of all survival. And once we establish that, only thereafter we get into a second term or system 2 of thinking, right? Having said that, we can't always sort of say that, okay, we can observe, right? Again, we sort of take this observation and we have focused, let's say, with a primary research focus over the years at the IYEA, we sort of collect data ourselves, observe things by ourselves. Again, due to obvious constraints, we will probably not be doing this year and not for the foreseeable future. We hope to begin at some point. But the idea is when we can't do this and we can't obviously sort of get surveys conducted by all, what do you do then? You start to try to look at history. You try to look at how other people have looked at things. Sort of both Professor Keynes, or Lord Keynes, if I may, as well as sort of Professor Milton Friedman, sort of diverging views in that sense, in economics. But both of them sort of laid ample emphasis on historical realities. Right? Obviously, when you're building up data, you have to look at the historical approaches, the context, and the policies that have evolved over time. In this regard, a good book, and I believe this is with one of our interns from earlier, the book is called Worldly Philosophers, right? And I'm just referring to the notes for the name of the author because the surname I'm not perhaps able to pronounce. Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbromer, right? You can pardon me on my pronunciation of the surname. This deals with how economic thought has evolved over the years. The main sort of people in those fields, right? Sort of, of course, Adam Smith, sort of, even Adam, like from even before that era, you have Malthusian school of thought, then you get Adam Smith, you get a sort of Keynes, you even get a Marx, you get a sort of Milton Friedman, and sort of after the Austrian school, and so on and so forth that evolved, right? How did economics sort of school of thought evolve? I think it's a very important area to study because you get necessary context and that helps you sort of understand the problems that you're facing right now as well. Just a very small example regarding that. To a certain extent, we've sort of done some papers in this regard as well. Helps us sort of analyze data as well, but also most importantly, policy problems. Right now, you might say that, let's say the tariff policy of the current United States administration is a very novel new one. But maybe if you look at history, you realize that it was not till, let's say, the 20th century. The United States, by the way, existed in 1776, 1789, if you go by the sort of Constitution and the Bill of Charter, Bill of Rights, etc., coming in. But the first act they ever passed was a tariff. And it was not till sort of Woodrow Wilson's administration in the early 20th century that you got the first reductions in these tariffs. And then sort of in FDR age, when there's a significant reduction, and then sort of by the time you reach the age of, let's say, post-Nixon, LBJ era, that you sort of completely do away with it and America becomes the free trade international economy that you sort of have known it to be. So maybe the norm was something different. Maybe the sort of approach the American policymakers took was very different. And maybe a mere vacuum in reading of sort of economics by itself is not going to suffice. That's why a sort of contextual reading with history is absolutely necessary. Which gets me to the sort of second idea, second broad area of history and politics. I'll very briefly touch on this. So there are historians who deal with sort of the idea of, okay, the Mark Bloch, who deals with the idea, okay, what are the tools of a historian? Is he a scientist? Is he an artist? And as much as I don't sort of get into the details, okay, either of them is correct. He deals with this in a sense that the tools that you have, that is to read history, to look at data, to look at archaeological data, etc. We can't do much of that right now. At least when you look at resources, is that the approach, like a painter, he says, the way you hold your brush, the way you move it around has to be scientific, right? Whether you make sort of broad strokes, when you mix two palettes, right, colors, red and white will make certain shade of pink. There is a scientific approach to that. But what you paint, that's more of an artistic approach. Having said that, right, and as much as sort of everyone indulges in sort of theorizing, cutting with patterns, the idea of history is also to enjoy it, right? And a good way of understanding it is not, okay, okay, this is why this thing happened. Towards the end of all of this, history will eventually lead to the end of history, right? All the events in history will eventually sort of get to the end of history, as Professor Fukuyama says, or let's say in the approach sort of taken by the Hegelians, if I may. That at some point, all of history will transform itself and they will sort of lead to, let's say, an end point. Now that sort of just the approach and the sort of end point by Professor Fukuyama is sort of contrasted with his mentor, Professor Samuel Huntington, who writes first as an article and thereafter the classic Clash of Civilizations. And those of you who take an approach and take an interest in international relations might also be interested in this field. The approach here is that, okay, if you sort of do away with communism, you do away with fascism, on some level, there are nation states that are actually civilization states. And those will be the fault lines of the future. So he correctly predicts that at some point there will be a Ukrainian crisis. At some point there will be, let's say, a crisis in the Middle East. By the way, all of this is happening in 91. Right? So these areas that he sort of deals with, the idea is not to sort of look at, like I said, history in a way that, okay, this is to end at some point. In terms of sort of the analysis that you're trying to bring to the table, but to rather look at it, okay, again, we must not be bogged down with survivorship bias. Right? We have to look at it in the sense that, okay, what if, right? I know some people might say, okay, this is this childish play, right? But it helps you understand, right? I understand the idea of counterfactuals. I think Professor Neil Ferguson, who's written extensively in economic history and political history, takes this approach forward in virtual history. Right? He deals with alternative histories and sort of virtual histories, counterfactuals. What if this particular thing happened? What would have been the case? What if the Treaty of Versailles never happened and sort of Germany maybe won the war? What could have been the situation there, so on and so forth. So these are approaches you take, right? I'm not getting into the matter of things. Maybe those of you who sort of opt for the specific subjects, are with the specific mentors, maybe can deal with this in that stage, right? Having said that, just a sort of brief point is about politics, because history is sort of linked in that sense. We do not sort of shy away from researching either policy or politics. So there are two sort of important parts here. When you're dealing with policy, you have to deal with two things. One, precautionary principle. When you're trying to say, okay, this is a positive thing we must do, you must first look at a precautionary principle, okay? First, do no harm. Secondly, when you look at a harm principle, when you look at, okay, these are my rights, this is what I can do. Is this causing a harm to someone else? It's an important consideration. Again, when you deal with law, when you deal with political philosophy, you deal with these ideas. But the other idea that deals with politics in terms of real politics, right? In terms of strategy, a cutthroat competition, okay? Political parties is, for example, I'll give you an example in another paper by one of our other, the intern that we had last year, Ambeka wrote this paper on one nation, one election policy, right? So there are two ways that we can have gone about. One is that we look at the policy. What is the benefit of the state? What is the benefit of the exchequer? What is the benefit of the public? The other idea is, okay, there's a political angle behind it, right? There's a strategy. There's a real political. Why does a political party support something? Why does a political party not support a policy? Now, this is to be divorced from public policy, right? Though it will be disguised, right? And that's the idea. You have to look behind the veil. You have to look at, okay, what are the intentions? That is how that has to be examined as well. While we do that, we must always divorce politics from policy. Right? I know that the reality obviously can't be, but we're trying to research things. At least our analysis should be, okay, there's also political angle to it, there's also policy angle to it. We try to sort of look at both things, but separately. The idea is not to sort of, when you are analyzing, sort of say, okay, I'm getting a bit of this, I'm getting a bit of that. Having said that, I must also emphasize that politics itself is also not scale free. those of you sort of wish to work in that direction, you realize that on some level, you realize that there is a certain policy that works at a federal level, and a certain policy that works best at a local level, certain policies that work best at a state level, right? So that's where we get to the idea that politics by itself is not scale free in that regard. And we must always sort of take this into account, right? I would look at this approach, and maybe we can sort of get back to this when I get to the end of it, what kind of sort of ethics we bring to the table in this regard. But having said that, that strategy in that sense, all I'm saying is the strategy of political approach must sort of differ from the public policy approach, right? Which also gets me to the idea that when we sort of end on, let's say, the note of sort of a harm principle that gets us to the question of law, and when we're sort of dealing with history and political science, and I don't want to call it science, but let's just call it politics and policy, or governance structures, if I may, law plays a very important role there, right? And now when I get to the question of law, I believe history has to play a very important role. And like I said, if you were there in some of in the welcome address, the idea is to give it the necessary context, is to give history, give law the necessary context. So again, I will get to the idea of, okay, how do you go about researching a specific proposition? How do you go about researching a specific sort of question of law? But let's sort of look at once as to where the idea of a particular law comes from. Right? So how do we look at this? Let's assume there's a particular judgment by the Delhi High Court. It cites a judgment of the Supreme Court that comes at an earlier stage. It's an old judgment, let's say 55. Thereafter, the Supreme Court, like that particular judgment, the Supreme Court relies on the federal court. And this is the court which existed between 47 and 50. Right? That's when the Constitution was still to come up. At the same time, sort of we were independent. In this regard, the federal court then relies on precedents from the Privy Council. The Privy Council relies, let's say, on principles of sort of English jurisprudence. They rely on, let's say, what is known as common law. Where does common law come from? It comes from, let's say, some practices coming from the canon law, or law that's sort of developed in terms of precedent, and even in terms of sort of declaration by the clergy, which sort of, in some sense, in tradition, in the British context, we will deal with, let's say, you can sort of trace it back to, yes, I will be taking questions. I will be, let's say, again, we'll take some questions right after this before we get into academic writing. But let's say we can trace back that tradition to clergy, the canon law, then we can sort of trace it back to Anglo-Saxon tradition. Then that can be further traced back to, let's say, the Norman Conquest in 1066. If you trace that sort of further back, you can sort of go back to Roman law. Right? Roman law can sort of further be traced back, let's say, if at all you want to sort of go into the idea of sort of Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi, etc. The idea here is that if you have the necessary historical context, I'll give you an example here. We have, and the other day, the day of our session, the first session, 15 June, marked the 805th year of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is perhaps the first time that you see the phrase liberty and life come together, right? Right to liberty and life. Which again goes back to the sort of American constitutional framework, the Declaration of Independence, etc., the pursuit, happiness, liberty, life. And then our Article 21 in the Indian Constitution, a right to life and liberty. If you look at the historical context, how it evolves. In a similar way, when you look at law, again, I'm getting to the idea of how you go about searching a question of law. We're not looking at facts, we're not looking at how to read case briefs, etc., to leave stuff for a later stage. If you look at it, again, you look at a bare provision, you look at the first page, you look at what is the background of the act. Is there an act before it which it replaces? Certainly you look at case laws, you look at judgments, that's there. But you look at what was the committee that was forming it thinking? What is the intent of the legislature? And by legislature, I don't have to mean, let's say, someone who opposed it in parliament and their views. The intent of, let's say, the mover of the bill. What is their intent? And for example, give an example, very short example of, let's say, a clash between the Patents Act and the CCI. very short example, you have something called section 140 and 141, the Patents Act, which sort of equates to section 44, 45 of the 1970 Act, and which is earlier in, let's say, I believe section 38, 39. I may be wrong in the specific section of the Patents Act, which existed in the United Kingdom even before that. The idea was that the patents controller, the regulator of patents, could look at anti-competitive issues pertaining to grants of license pertaining to patents. Now, when the United Kingdom brought in a competition law in, let's say, 1999, and then I think it was sort of again amended and sort of got more effective, and the implementation was maybe a couple of years down the line, they repealed these sections. In India, section 140, 141 were not repealed, which meant that, as one interpretation could be, that the intent of the legislature is that that part, or at least the anti-competitive part pertaining to patents or, let's say, other intellectual property laws, must still remain with that respective controller and not the CCI. Again, this is a developing issue of law. We've written about it. Maybe you can read up about it. A lot of people are writing about it. But again, this is one approach where you sort of look at historical context of how a law is drafted and how to give it the necessary statutory interpretation. Now, there are rules of statutory interpretation, all of that we'll get at a later stage. But my idea was to sort of give you a necessary context and how to sort of look at the law with a separate approach, with a new approach, with a different methodology. Right? Now, before I get to academic writing, right? Again, examples again, similarly with the United States Constitution. They have a preamble in itself. Should that be compared to our preamble, or should our preamble, let's say, be compared to what the United States has in the sense of a Declaration of Independence? When you look at the Constitution of America, you can look at something called the Federalist Papers. When you say there's a deadlock in the United States Congress, and let's say with the president or between the two houses of Congress, you say, oh, this system is not working. Maybe the intent of the founding fathers in the United States was to have that deadlock, was to have that clash. And for that, you have to sort of go back to the Federalist Papers and see what is the intent. Having said that, another very small approach that I want to take up is the ideas, like, not just in the context of law, but also in the question of politics. And sort of, again, it sort of boils down to even economics law everywhere, that on some level, people sort of try to narrow down issues to just right and left, conservative and progressive. I would say, and again, drawing from Professor Taleb's works in this regard, that we'd rather look at things from the angle of what is effective and not effective, and what is, in a sense, rigorous and not rigorous. In a sense, what we could categorize as, in terms of conservative or progressive, if we may, the difference is not that people don't want change, but the rate at which we want change, right? In a sense, because if you get in change at a really fast pace, at some point, the changes that were brought in at an earlier stage will not reach their maximum effectiveness if they're replaced by, let's say, new change in policies. The idea is also to sustain the benefits out of that, right? Again, this idea is not about sort of the extremes. The idea is that an approach that you take to politics, history, and to law and economics in that regard, right? I will obviously be getting to questions of academic writing. I do realize that many of you are sticking with us, and I think that's, that means that I'm not boring all of you. So before I move to academic writing, I'll be willing to take some questions regarding, let's say, the approach that I've suggested. These are some of the approaches. Your mentor will focus on this. I will personally focus on this at a later stage. If there are any questions, we can first entertain those, right? Because I believe the academic writing part is a separate part altogether. And again, we can, if you guys are interested, we can continue with that. But at the same time, I'll wait for a while. If there are any questions pertaining to these sort of research methodologies and approaches that we can take to, let's say, secondary research in that regard. So do we have any questions? You can either send them privately. Okay, yes. Okay. So Deepa is asking a question as to COVID not being considered a black swan, but could be considered a gray rhino, because, you know, the whereabouts from the beginning in terms of losses and costs would lag the end responsive measures. Now, so that's the idea, right? That an approach to, let's say, again, I get your metaphor as well, that all rhinos, in fact, like I think the general approach to rhinos is that they are gray. Again, my understanding of sort of zoology, sort of biology in this regard is not the best, so I don't know about the specifics of colors. But I would say this, that if your intention by mentioning the phrase gray rhino is that it's something that was known to all, yes, that is the approach that I'm suggesting here, that we perhaps lacked on the effective measures that we could have taken at an earlier stage, right? An earlier stage in the sense that had we taken the necessary precautions, let's say a lockdown at the point where you have, let's say, only 1 or 2 cases, maybe there would be no requirement for a lockdown up until this point. Right now, policymakers will think, okay, no, this requires more political will. This requires sort of people think, okay, why do we need to shut down for 2 cases? Nothing happens. Right? This is just a common flu. More people die of car attacks, etc. Then that approach sort of comes in. And that's the sort of fallacy that is here, that you look at things merely by as they appear to you, and so they sort of are. What you're saying is absolutely correct, Deepa, that in a sense we lacked in the policy responsiveness. And that's why people sort of try to shun away responsibility by saying that, okay, this is a black swan, we couldn't have done anything about it. Obviously, governments all over the world knew what's happening, but perhaps they looked at tangible realities. They looked at, okay, maybe we can't sort of go with this. There's economic considerations, there are policy considerations, there's political will. There are other factors that come into play. But if you're looking at, let's say, implementing if you say the risk aversion policies at an earlier stage, if you take the extreme policies, let's say huge lockdowns, severe lockdowns at the extremely early stage, the economic loss that you face at a later stage is reduced significantly. There's no need for lockdown, let's say, at a later stage. But yes, the reason why this example was brought in was because on some level, people tend to sort of use phrases, right? And I think you sort of pointed that out, and that gets me to the next part about, so if I get to the idea of sort of the ethics of arguments, that on some level, we must avoid, and this is a great fallacy in our public discourse, and is verbalism, right? Where we use buzzwords. We just keep on using buzzwords. X, Y, Z. This is the problem. That's the problem. Without the words having any meaning. When we're looking at a rational thinking process, now again, our conclusion can be simple. Our question can be simple. But our approach, our method has to be very rigorous. It has to be very complex. Because we're dealing with complex realities in the world. We have to account for as many factors as we can, because we can't always account for all of them. And the idea is to give meaning to every word. That you have to give meaning to that process. You have to give meaning to every word that you get on board. Because when you're sort of just throwing around random buzzwords, there's no meaning to what you're doing. You're just dealing in abstracts. And that is our intention. That is what we wish to avoid. Right? I'll take the questions that we have on the substance area. If you don't have any other questions, then maybe I can move to academic. Right. You can sort of pitch in questions. You don't have to sort of wait for me to wait. Aman, is there should we wait out for a while? If someone's sending in questions, I'm told that silence is to be presumed as yes when it comes to online webinars and all of that. Irrespective, I'll wait for a minute maybe if you have any other questions. Otherwise, we move to sort of ideas about academic writing. And like I said, we're not looking at this to be a less than hour module, maybe longer. And I'm assuming that you guys aren't getting bored, so I'm sort of going to continue with this for a while, right? Because academic writing was intended to be a part of it. Okay, I think people are increasing in number at this point. Yes, and I have Aman's approval, so I will go ahead with academic writing. Right now, just very briefly to touch upon what it is. Right? The idea of academic writing is to use a methodical approach to present your argument, demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of an issue in a proper structured format. Right? So when you write an academic paper, there can be variations. You can call it a research paper, an essay, an article, and there are different components to them. There are different factors. And these are sort of more descriptive things in which sort of we can send you links about and you can get to know about them. Right? So what are the initial parts of the structure? I just want to give a broad idea what a structure of academic paper has to be. This has to include, again, this is very varied. Everyone has their own opinions. You can sort of, it varies from subject to subject, varies from writer to writer, it varies on sort of the kind of argument that you're taking, varies on sort of the approach that you're taking. Are you writing a book? Are you writing a paper? Are you writing for a blog? Are you writing for a journal? Changes. I'm just giving a very sort of broad idea here. You can sort of alternate, sort of change a little here and there, tinker around, right? And we'll be there to sort of guide you specifically as to what model fits you best. But the idea is, one, you begin with an initial focus. You sit down and realize, okay, what is my question? What is the problem I'm trying to tackle? What is the specific question? You narrow it down as much as you can, okay? Policy responses, let's say, to COVID is still a very generic idea, okay? How, let's say, individual precaution is the best way. It's an obligation, in fact, to reduce systemic risks in sort of fat tail risk events, such as pandemics. Well, it's a very specific idea. Right? Again, that deals with the generic notion. It sort of applies to broader problems, but the question itself, the scope of field, sort of operation at least is specific. You should try to do the very same with your work. Right? Let's say, is the Indian government's policy over the last sort of 30, 40 years focused towards, has any, if not an intent, at least the outcome of Indian policy has been, let's say, to increase land prices, or maybe to decrease land prices. That's a question you ask when you look at how to structure that. So you list out the problem. You look at, okay, what is my methodology? Okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to utilize these papers. This is the literature review that is available. So there's a literature that's available. People have written about it. You review that. Okay, these are what these people are saying. These are the arguments put forth. And then you get to your arguments. How do you get that? You present a background. You say, okay, this is what has happened up until now. Then you say, okay, this is a description of the problem, right? This is the, you list out. You present the facts. Thereafter, you present your arguments and your analysis. So what is this? So you look at the domain in which you're dealing, either economic tools or statutory laws or case laws, and you interpret, provide your interpretation. That will obviously clash with, let's say, another interpretation. That's where your argument comes in. Your argument comes in. There is another argument from the other side that you must entertain. And then you must present an argument to that. Then you must sort of continue that loop until and unless you get to like one point where you say, okay, this is where I'm ending. This is where sort of I come to a conclusion. Right? That's where you say, okay, this is my finding. My analysis shows me that this is the finding. This is the conclusion of the problem. And this is the possible solution. This is a possible policy recommendation. This is the reason why this happens. Right? This is like a broad idea of how to sort of the approach that you take. So you go with a background, you go with description, you go with some literature reviews, you go with analysis, you go with your argument, you go with your findings, you go with conclusions. Now within these are two ways that I sort of broadly go with, but there are sort of more ways to go by this. Again, I'm not getting into qualitative or quantitative because we're not in a position to conduct primary research in that regard. But I would say this, that at least on one angle, there can be an argument where you go with to, fro, right? For example, let's say if I go with the question of why did Germany want to intervene in the Spanish Civil War? Let's say the first argument could be ideological reasons. That's debunked by, let's say, the next level of argument against it. Then the next line of argument is they want to test out their weaponry and machinery. Then the third argument for that is that they want to, let's say, want to create a balancing, like what you call balancing in terms of international real political scenarios, right? Balancing of power between nations. So you keep on sort of bringing up these arguments, the four arguments, the sort of arguments in favor of this proposition. Then you sort of come up with sort of arguments against why this is not the case, why this is not the case. And ultimately you say, okay, maybe their consideration was that there was an economic angle to it. They wanted to make Spain an informal colony under Franco. And they could sort of export to them and import to them from them, let's say, natural resources and sort of raw materials. So this is an entire approach. You say, okay, to, fro, right? That's one approach. The other approach is where you say, okay, okay, this is my argument. When I get to my arguments, I get to my analysis, I say, okay, this is my sub-argument. This is my another sub-argument, right? For example, if I'm dealing with, let's say, the idea of Article 21, I would say, okay, this is what the Constituent Assembly intended it to be. Number two, this is what this particular judgment stated. But you say, okay, an alternative view is maybe in Justice Fazal Ali's dissent in A.K. Gopalan. And then you say, okay, this dissent then sort of is to be looked at in the context. So what is the difference between, let's say, procedure established by law versus due process of law? Even though the Indian Constitution says there is procedure established by law, in which judgment you get, and the judgment here is Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India, is how do you get to the idea of, okay, when it becomes due process of law, what is meant by due process of law? So these specific areas, right? Statutory interpretation, historical context, what the judges had to say, when the dissent becomes law, right? So these are the sub-arguments that you pitch, right? Okay. And these sub-arguments are then, in a sense, sure, they still go with the for, against, because that approach is the approach, the Socratic method as we call it. It is, as you would say, the some might call it sort of the Hegelian method. I don't want to sort of get into sort of giving it a naming in that sense. But I would say that that's what critical thinking is, right? Like you critique, right? Critical comes from critique, and that sort of flows from there. Then I sort of get to the question of plagiarism. In short, and I think I wouldn't want to end a session without a bad dad joke. I would say this, drawing from like one of my seniors that I worked with at some point, and this is happening in a case which dealt with related issues of intellectual property, where he stated in sort of a lighter tone that ek copy ka right hota hai. And again, pay attention to this, because this is, I think, how I sort of want to introduce plagiarism to all of you, because this is absolutely important, right? Academic honesty and sort of avoiding academic dishonesty is very important to all education institutions, but the IYEA as well. And we take that very seriously. एक कॉपी का राइट होता है और एक कॉपीराइट होता है, आपके पास दोनों नहीं है, right? The idea here is that you try to give credit, not try to, you have to give credit for the analysis, for the arguments that you are drawing from those who've already dealt with a given question, right? Having said that, that does not mean that you can't sort of bring up the arguments that these people have brought in. Now, again, you could intentionally do this, or you could unintentionally do this, right? Where you say that you try to sort of pitch, you end up pitching someone else's work as yours. Many have done that. Many do it inadvertently as well. But we will still try to avoid that. How do we avoid it? We read more on the issue. So you realize that at some point or the other, there has been someone who's written about this. And on some level, they have already dealt with the argument you're dealing with. And you can say, okay, this person, if I were to say, okay, Professor Hayek or Friedrich Hayek has dealt with the question of private currencies. And his primary argument in this regard is X, Y, and Z. One can be in agreement with argument Y for this particular reason. To build upon that argument, one could argue that, okay, this argument plays out this way and sort of correlates to, let's say, a Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, so on and so forth. The idea of referencing, of citation, is not just to give credit, but to give due credit, to do it properly, right? So that's where you get into the idea of referencing and citations, right? There are specific formats. We will be sending in links. I think the better idea is that you directly get to the primary sources that deal with it. You have Oxford, you have APA, you have Chicago, you have Harvard. You have these 3-4 broad areas. If you get into schools of law, there's Oscola, there's the Blue Book. And so every field, every university, every institute has their own way. You can deal with either, right? Again, you try to be as specific as much as you want in terms of your field. But the idea is that you be uniform, right? If you're going with, let's say, one type of approach, let's say Blue Book or Scholar, you stick with that through that entire. Nowadays, people change that where they sort of hyperlink the article that they're trying to sort of talk about. Many just sort of reference in the end saying, okay, I might not be able to number because the platform you're writing on. So you just sort of cite in terms of, okay, these are references. And those are some of the ways that you can sort of look at that. Again, we will be sending you links on this. I believe that if I were to get on sort of, okay, what do you cite and sort of how do you go about it, that will take a lot of time, and that's not something that's necessarily not descriptive. Having said that, some of the core things that you should sort of focus on is the name of the author, journal, book, publisher is still one thing. People sort of in old school sort of brought in the city it was published in, year, because the same author might have sort of multiple papers in that same regard in the sort of different years. Then you sort of, some people even get in the idea of URL and also date it was accessed on. That's, I think, there is a rationale behind that as well. That's the more sort of modern approach, because you must also cite, let's say, videos, podcasts, lectures, interviews. All of these things have to be cited in a sense. It was sort of apart from the fact that it adds to your credibility, it's important because it shows you that, okay, I think I'm getting some questions. I should also deal with that. Claim to citation and Reservation can be motto too. Yes, I think yes, I think Deepa has sort of talked about this. Again, just drawing from that and building on that. The idea does not have to be, okay, if you've cited, you can copy paste. You can never copy paste. And the idea about that is not to sort of go about, okay, I'm reading something, I'm listening to something, I just take down notes, okay? Because when you sort of try to convert that, you sort of go with the same language. So what do? The preliminary reading of something should be sort of get an idea of what it is. And thereafter, when you've, let's say, read one chapter or let's say one part of the paper, you make your own notes in your own language about that at a later stage. Once you do that, then you get back to it at a later stage for a slower reading, a second reading. Then sort of the idea is that plays with your own notes. It's in your own language. And it has your own analysis to it. The idea is not to say, okay, Professor Friedman says so, and post that we will get to a point where we will say, okay, but I'm not even bringing in something of my own. This is only a description. So I can also sort of copy paste. No, nothing to it. Right? You must always cite even the sort of slightest mention you're making of anything. Never try to sort of even sort of say, okay, I'll paraphrase and get over with it. No. You have to sort of go the hard way. And that's what I'm saying, that when you look at the scientific method, though we're not sort of dealing with, let's say, the hard sciences here, but the method is still to be followed. Like I started, on some level, you can have a simple question, you can have a simple answer, but you must have a complex or rigorous or tough way through. Your method, your approach has to be rigorous for the endpoint to be effective in that regard, right? If you have any questions regarding this, you can pitch in. Otherwise, I will proceed further to the ethics of argumentation, right? Like I said, verbalism is to be avoided at all grounds. Professor Taleb talks about this to a large extent. And that's why he gets in the argument. And for those of you who sort of want to study law or are studying law, the idea of law is that there is meaning to every word. There is meaning to every comma. I know it's, you might think, okay, this is a fantastical approach. Comma ka kya farak padta hai? Believe you me, I say this from practical experience. I have worked on matters where a placement of a comma has actually made a significant difference in a matter pertaining to crores of rupees in terms of their recovery, in terms of sort of payment of that debt. I'm obviously not going to get into the details of that idea, but the point here is that nothing is to be taken for granted. There are no buzzwords in the real world. There must be meaning to everything that you say and write, every word. And you can talk to our interns about this. You can talk to our research associates about this. You can talk to Aman. You can talk to Ria. You can talk to Ambika. You can talk to even Satya. That when we get to reviewing your papers, and as much as we can, we try to review each word, each sentence, not just okay, broad paragraphs. It is our intent, right? Obviously, as people increase, as number increase, we have mentors who will be doing this. We'll have sort of writing mentors who will be specifically also focusing on this with you. Wherever I get the capacity to mentor some of you, I will be focusing on this with you. But the idea is that you focus on the sort of meaning of every word, every comma, right? For example, look at this, right? I don't sort of get into this, but let's say there's this sort of very fat book, right? You can read this. This is Words and Phrases by the Supreme Court, right? I'm just going to open up something, a random page, right? I'm going to open up negligence. Now there's something that begins on neglect, neglect to pay, negligence, 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 negligence. Something is in the context of the Penal Code, section 304A. Something is in the context of a certain consumer unity case, right? Something is in the context of a breach of duty and stems from, let's say, tort law. There's something dealing with Motor Vehicles Act. There's something that's dealing with contributory negligence. So it goes on. It goes on for pages, right? I'm flipping pages, and that sort of context to that word in the different context of sort of the law, what kind of case you're dealing with, the meaning for that word keeps on sort of evolving. And that's the point I'm trying to pitch in here. They do not play around with buzzwords, right? If you go by some of the great authors, I'm forgetting who even said this, but someone did, and you can check this up. The greatest weapon that sort of mankind has is that humans have is words. Having said that, I think the whole idea is as all of you might have sort of heard, is that the pen is mightier than the sword, right? Or as you might say, and I think now I must border on worse jokes as we move towards the end, that the e-pen or the pencil is mightier than the sword. Right? Moving away from my pathetic jokes. Again, important part that apart from giving meaning to words, you must give meaning to your process, the method that you apply. You must always be fair to your opponents, right? When you're presenting an argument against, let's say, one individual or one set of arguments, you must tackle them. You must sort of face them head on. You can't say that, okay, I'm going to wriggle around. There's a procedural error here and there, which is what, let's say, Mr. Naval Ravikant deals with in the idea where he says that there is enough literacy out there, but there isn't enough numeracy. Like where you say, okay, you don't look at the context of things. You say, okay, नहीं वो वहाँ पे गलत है. नहीं ये तो गलत है ना आपका. आपने बहुत बढ़िया पेपर लिखा, but आपका spelling mistake तो गलत था ना. For example, there's this report, like I was mentioning about the patents report, the report which a younger committee report which deals with the coming in of the Patents Act. There's a slight mistake. There's an error, I think, where they deal with sections rather than, let's say, if there's 1 and 2, they read it as section 2 and 3. And in our paper, we sort of deal with, now we don't sort of get into arguing with that position. We just mention that and we move ahead. We deal with the substance of the argument, right? While as those of you want to be lawyers will obviously deal with procedure, but you would also want to sort of look at sort of long-term approach that you want sort of relief for clients on a more substantive point rather than, okay, procedure will get you, let's say, from date A to B. Your point is to be sort of well prepared for date A to Z, right? And that's why sort of the rigor, the long, the sort of more rigorous, I would say, sort of, you shouldn't call it sort of the tough, but sort of more real approach sort of comes into play, right? You have to follow the process, like I said. There's no sort of way around it. On some level, also don't fall for the trap of arguing for the sake of arguing. I know I brought this at an earlier stage as well. Sure, you have to avoid charlatans. But the idea, like I've sort of stated this in my earlier discussions with you guys as well, at least in the welcome address, and maybe others are sort of joining in, maybe mentors in other ways, is that the idea is to get to the truth. So if I were to draw from, I think, economists, historians, lawyers, everyone, is that judges, in fact, is that go with the process first. Do not come up with a conclusion first and then say, okay, let me frame the argument around this conclusion. That is the most important part, and that's the most important takeaway that you must take from this. That there is no way where you can say that you've been academically honest and rigorous, where you've already reached the conclusion and said, okay, now I'll reverse engineer this and I'll tell you what the argument is or the reasoning behind this is. That is a very dishonest approach. Some might do it sort of inadvertently. That's one school of thought. But that comes from biases, right? We must acknowledge them. The moment we start acknowledging them, we sort of go on the path that, okay, we have to get the procedure first. We can't sort of conform to an idea and say, okay, I will build an argument around this. It's very important, right? I think, having said that, I think we can take some questions, but other than that, I would say, and I would like to end on this note, as I've said earlier as well, and I'm sort of drawing from some of the very recent papers from Professor Taleb. All of his readings are up online. He just focuses on this area, that you must always avoid what is called naive empiricism, right? And I think I've dealt with this question earlier as well, that on some level, you cannot say that if you're studying a question, or if you're studying a specific field, that you must always look at it in the most neutral manner. Your idea is to get to the truth, right? You don't have to sort of put yourself on a pedestal by saying, no, I have to look at it neutrally. I have to look at it objectively. So sure, you can say one side says this, the other side says this, but then you have to put in your effort into it, into analyzing and examining, okay, why is it that one argument is better than the other? Why is it that in the face of evidence, in the face of time, one argument holds over the other? The pursuit is not mere attempted or pseudo objectivity or neutrality, but truth, right? With that, I think we're sort of at an end, at least from my side, pretty much an hour and a half. If there are any questions, I'll wait for a couple of minutes, and you can send in some questions if you wish. And if there aren't any, you can send them privately, you can send them in public. I'll wait for a minute maybe. Till then I can sort of talk a bit about the procedural focus. Many of you might have received your emails regarding mentors. Many of you will be receiving it, let's say, over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours, right? For some of you were even sort of, because they're so specialized areas that you want to focus on. We're trying to getting even more mentors on board. For those of you who aren't receiving emails in terms of mentors and introducing them, I would say think about how specific you have been with your research interests that you discussed with us. Again, for that, you can wait, let's say, the next 24, 48 hours. I must share with you that our research associates, Ria, Kishika, and Aman, have been staying up sort of all night over the last few days, just going over this entire process. Because you must realize, right, on sort of whole horizon over the last few weeks, we see over sort of 150. If I look at sort of emails and sort of later editions, maybe 180 odd applications, and to sort of sort them out into specific areas, specific focuses, specific sort of mentors, specific expertise, standard of sort of writing, etc. Takes up a lot of time, takes up a lot of effort. And I hope all of you respect that. I hope all of you sort of give worthy recognition, some appreciation to the effort that our research associates have put into it. They've been up all night, I've been up with them. And I hope that at least that is, you take that seriously, right, when you get to that point where you're dealing with your mentors. Yes, so mentor allocation mails will be coming in. I'm getting a private question. Okay, I understand. Many of you don't have sort of resources because, I mean, by resources, I mean reading materials and what to read, what to view, what to listen to. We will share all of that. Right? That is what I mentioned earlier. You don't have to worry about the substance. At some point, you will be going through modules that deal with this in this substance. And you will be dealing with all of this when your mentors focus on these particular areas. We will share reading materials with you. We will sort of, see, we're not in a position to sort of share books with you. But like I said, sort of, I mentioned some of the books which are with some of the other people. Some of the people who've been working with us, some of the people who have worked with us. So whatever is in our capacity to get resources to you, believe you me, this is part of our main tenets, our main objectives of the IYEA, to provide young economists with resources, right? So whatever we can do in that regard, we will. We'll begin with our research associates sharing with you some of the links for citation guides from Chicago, Oxford, APA, Oscola, Harvard, Blue Book, some of the sort of core areas, how to go about it, how to avoid plagiarism, etc. I think it's best that you sort of get it from them. Let's go over that briefly. And those things can be tackled at that stage. I'm getting a couple of more questions. I'll take them. We'll get to it first. Okay. Also, would you require? Okay, absolutely. We are trying to put up each of our videos up on YouTube, right? Like I understand some of you might not be attending. You might have personal difficulties, and many of you might want to revisit this at the later stage, right? So it is our intention to put up everything on YouTube. You'll have to be slightly patient with us. These are long videos. They take some time. Like I said, we are right now focusing on allocating your mentors to you, which is going to be pretty much a permanent thing. Like the video will come up at some stage, but we're focusing on that area. You will be getting in your emails. You will be sort of attached to, let's say, WhatsApp groups at some stage. And that'll be sort of your guiding process over the next 1 month, maybe more. So once that's done, we will sort of we'll upload all of our videos. Don't worry about that at all. Right? Whatever we can share with you, we will share with you. Are there any books that, absolutely, there will be books, there will be resources. And your mentors will be sharing them with you based on what area focuses you have, right? We obviously cannot say that, okay, take all books at our disposal because we want the best resources to be sort of more specific for everyone, for the specific areas that they wish to focus on. That's how we will be allocating resources, right? Obviously, there will be, let's say, a common pool of resources in terms of you will get a specific, similar resources if you have a similar, say, mentor. That goes without saying. If you have a similar area of focus, there will be certain preliminary readings, like I mentioned some of the thinkers, right? I think some of the mentors might prescribe them as sort of preliminary readings. Let's say people who are sort of dealing with a specific question of law might say, okay, you approach this way. This is one particular chapter. There are these particular judgments which you can read. So those things will be similar. And those of you focusing on an area will get reading material. That's the idea of this. We want to give you a wholesome approach, a wholesome training, a wholesome mentorship. You will get materials. Whatever is in our capacity, whatever is legal, whatever we can provide without any violations or contraventions, we will, right? I think we're drawing to 12:30 now. That's 15 years from the Magna Carta. And if there are no other questions, I will be bringing this to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. We will be getting in touch with you, introducing your mentors to you. Our sessions on finance will be beginning from Tuesday at 11 a.m. The scheduled first lecture for finance is Introduction to Financial Markets and Financial Instruments. We're dealing with the very basic concepts, definitional stuff. Mrs. Neoma Pasricha will be dealing with that. She's one of our trustees. She has her MSc in finance from the London School of Economics, is a gold medalist, a prize awardee there from there, has an extensive background in finance. And she will be dealing with some of the initial sort of concepts of finance. And from thereafter, we will deal with the more advanced concepts and we'll get to the other fields, right? Obviously, the posters and the details and date and time will be shared with you in advance. And so let's say the finance mentors will anyway be we'll be hearing them over the course of this coming week, Tuesday to Saturday. At the same time, the other mentors will be getting in touch with you. You will be getting in touch with them, and you can sort of continue your conversation with them at mutual convenience, right? Having said that, I think we've covered most of the procedural aspects as well. Aman, Kishika, Ria, Satya, if there's anything else that we need to let our interns, our applicants, our mentees know, I can share with them at this stage. Otherwise, we can sort of bring this session to an end. Right? I don't think there is anything specific. So thank you so much once again for joining in. I hope you continue to join in the coming sessions. I hope all of you are, in a sense, gaining from these sessions. You're learning something, but most importantly, you are enjoying yourselves. Because the moment enjoying ends, it doesn't have to be fun. It has to be enjoyment for sure. And the moment it ends, I say, drop down that book. Right? Look at something else, what you enjoy. The moment that ends, you must stop, take a pause. And the moment you enjoy is the moment you realize that, okay, you're actually learning something. You're learning something new. And that's the focus. That's the focus of the IYEA. So, and like I said, we began with economics, and I want to end on that note, that our focus has been over the last 8 years, rethinking of economics, or economic rethinking and decision-making. And in that regard, I hope that at this point you think that you're making the right decision, sort of getting on board with us. And we are making the right decision, devoting our time, our energy, and our resources and efforts in trying to sort of get you to learn the most and get the most out of this program. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Feel free to write to us at any point. All the channels and resources are available to you. And obviously this video will be uploaded online on YouTube. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.